Starving, the old veteran found a hidden door beneath the snow. What he found inside made him cry. If you've ever known the kind of cold that makes your bones remember things you'd rather forget, then maybe you understand why Samuel walked the way he did. Slowly, carefully, as though the snow beneath his boots might give way to something deeper than frozen ground. The Montana wilderness in February holds a silence, so complete it becomes a kind of companion. And Samuel had grown accustomed to companions that asked nothing of him, expected nothing, offered nothing but their steady presence. The sky above stretched white and low, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the air tasted of iron and distance, that particular flavor the mountains hold when they're about to turn cruel. He had been walking for 3 days, though time moved differently out here, measured not in hours but in the space between one breath and the next, the distance between one pine tree and another, the slow burn in his legs that told him he was still alive, still moving, still something more than the cold itself. His coat, an old canvas thing he'd found in a church donation box 2 winters back, hung loose on shoulders that had once been broader, and his gloves were more whole than fabric, his fingers beneath them the color of old newspaper, that grayish yellow that speaks of bodies trying to hold on to warmth they no longer possess. The hunger lived in him like a third lung, expanding and contracting with each step, not painful exactly, but present, always present, a hollow ache that had moved beyond the stomach and settled somewhere deeper, in the marrow perhaps, or in whatever part of man remembers what it means to be fed, to be full, to sit at a table with others and break bread without counting the crumbs. He had eaten last. What was it? Yesterday, a handful of pine nuts he'd gathered from beneath a cluster of trees, their shells so hard his teeth had ached afterward, and before that, nothing he could quite remember, though he thought there might have been snow he'd melted in his mouth, pretending it was soup. Samuel was 73, though he looked older, and he had been a soldier once, back when his hands were steady and his eyes could see distances that now seemed impossible, back when the world had asked him to be hard and he had obliged, not knowing then that hardness, once learned, becomes a kind of armor you can never quite remove, even when the war is over. Even when you're alone in the wilderness with nothing but the wind for conversation. He carried no weapon now, hadn't for years, but his gait still held that careful watchfulness, that habit of noting exits and approaches, of never quite turning his back to the open spaces. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the way the air pressed against his skin, the way the birds had gone silent hours ago, the way the light seemed to thicken, as though the sky itself were holding its breath. He needed shelter, needed it soon, and so he walked with purpose now, his eyes scanning the tree line for anything that might offer refuge. A cave, an overhang, an abandoned hunter's shack, anything with walls and a roof, anything between him and the weather that was gathering its strength like a fist. If stories of quiet courage warm your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts by the fire, 1,000 souls who understand that the smallest acts of endurance are often the greatest. Maybe you're listening from a warm room tonight, maybe from a car on a long drive, maybe from somewhere you'd rather not be. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. He almost missed it, the cabin, because it sat so still and low against the hillside, half buried in drifts that had accumulated over what must have been years, its roof sagging under the weight of snow that had frozen and thawed and frozen again into something more like stone than water. The logs were dark with age and weather, the spaces between them chinked with moss and mud that had long since hardened, and one window, the only one visible, stared out like a blind eye, its glass either missing or so covered in frost it might as well have been. Samuel stood at the edge of the clearing, studying it the way a man studies anything he's about to trust his life to, looking for signs of occupancy, for smoke or tracks, or any indication that he wouldn't be alone if he stepped through that door. But there was nothing, only the silence that sat over everything like a blanket, and the wind beginning to pick up, and the first small flakes of snow starting to fall, light as ash, cold as judgment. He approached slowly, his boots breaking through the crust of old snow with sounds that seemed too loud, too intrusive, and when he reached the door he paused again, his hand on the wood, rough and splintered and so cold it burned, and listened. Nothing. He pushed, and the door resisted, stuck in its frame by ice and time. And he pushed harder, leaning his weight into it, and finally it gave with a groan that seemed to come from the cabin itself, a long exhalation of air that smelled of dust and rot, and something else, something almost sweet like dried flowers or old paper. Inside, the darkness took a moment to resolve into shapes, into the geometry of abandonment. A table leaning on 3 legs, the 4th broken off and lying nearby like a severed limb, a chair tipped on its side, a stove in the corner gone orange with rust, its door hanging open to reveal an interior filled with the gray powder of ancient ash. The floor was wood, warped and uneven, and covered in places with what might have been snow that had blown through cracks, or might have been something else, some pale dust that rose slightly when he stepped, catching the weak light from the doorway like tiny stars. Samuel closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind, and immediately the space felt smaller, more contained, more like a room and less like a cavity in the earth. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his body understand that it was no longer moving, no longer fighting the cold quite so directly, and he felt the exhaustion settle over him like a weight, felt his knees threaten to buckle, felt the hunger sharpen briefly before dulling again into that constant background hum. There was a shelf along one wall, bare except for a few items, a jar with something dark and crystallized at the bottom, a tin cup with a hole rusted through its side, a candle stub no longer than his thumb. He moved toward the stove first, hope rising despite his better judgment, and pulled open drawers, searching for matches, for tinder, for anything that might help him make fire. Nothing in the first drawer but mouse droppings and the brittle shell of a dead insect. Nothing in the second but a piece of cloth so rotted it fell apart when he touched it. The cold inside the cabin was different from the cold outside, still and heavy, a cold that had settled into the walls and floor and would take hours to dispel, even if he managed to build a fire, which seemed increasingly unlikely. His hands were shaking now, not just from cold, but from something else, from the effort of hoping and searching and finding nothing, from the mathematics of survival that were becoming clearer with each passing moment, that he had very little time, very little strength, very little of anything left. He turned to survey the room again, more carefully this time, looking not just for food or fire, but for any small thing that might help, any advantage however slight. And that's when he noticed the floor near the far corner, near where the stove stood, where the boards seemed to sit differently, seemed to catch the light in a way that suggested they weren't quite flush with the others, weren't quite part of the same surface. Samuel knelt slowly, his knees cracking with sounds like small branches breaking, and brushed away the dust and debris that had accumulated in the corner, his fingers finding the edges of boards that were separate from the others, that formed a shape, roughly square, perhaps 3 feet on each side, outlined in gaps that had been filled with dirt and time. He worked his fingers into one of the gaps, feeling splinters drive under his nails, feeling the wood resist and then shift slightly, and he pulled, his breath coming harder now, not from exertion so much as from the sudden presence of possibility, of something unknown waiting just beneath the surface of the known. The boards lifted as a single piece, hinged on one side, and beneath them was darkness and stone and the smell of earth that had been sealed away from light for longer than Samuel could guess. Steps led downward, rough-hewn from stone or carved from the bedrock itself, descending into a black that seemed absolute, that seemed to have weight and texture, that seemed to be not merely the absence of light, but a presence in its own right. He sat back on his heels, staring down into that opening, and felt something shift in his chest, something that might have been fear or might have been its opposite, that strange excitement that comes when the world reveals itself to be larger than you thought, more complex, more full of hidden spaces and secret chambers and things that wait in the dark for someone to find them. He had no flashlight, no lantern, nothing but the weak gray light filtering through the cabin's window, and that would be gone soon as the storm arrived and the afternoon faded into evening. The candle stub on the shelf, he had seen it, registered it without thinking, and now he rose and retrieved it, along with the tin cup despite its hole, and from his pocket he pulled a small box of matches, the last he had, 5 matches rattling inside like bones. His hands were so cold he could barely feel them, and the first match broke when he tried to strike it, and the second guttered out before touching the wick, and he made himself pause, made himself breathe, made himself wait until his hand steadied just slightly before trying again. The third match caught and held, and the candle wick took the flame reluctantly, smoking at first before settling into a small, steady point of light that seemed impossibly bright in the darkness of the cabin, that seemed to push back the shadows and fill the space with a warmth that was more psychological than real, but no less welcome for that. Samuel held the candle in one hand and placed the other on the edge of the trapdoor opening, steadying himself, and then he began to descend. The steps were narrow and uneven, and he had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through the opening, had to duck his head, had to move slowly because the candle flame wavered with each movement and threatened to go out, and he couldn't bear the thought of being down there in complete darkness, of not knowing what was around him, of not being able to find his way back up. The stone was cold against his palms when he steadied himself, and the air grew cooler as he descended, and damper, and he counted the steps without meaning to 7, 8, 9, until his boot touched level ground, and he stood at the bottom, in a space he couldn't yet fully see, holding the candle higher, waiting for the light to reveal what the earth had kept hidden. If this moment touches you, if you understand what it means to search in the dark, please subscribe. It helps these quiet stories be heard, helps them find the people who need them most. The cellar opened before him slowly, reluctantly, as the candlelight pushed against the darkness and found shapes that had been waiting there in patient silence. Shelves built into the stone walls, rough planks supported by brackets hammered into the rock, and on those shelves, rows of jars that caught the light and held it, that glowed with colors Samuel had almost forgotten existed. The deep purple of preserved plums, the amber gold of peach preserves, the dark red of tomatoes sealed away from time and air and decay. He stood very still, not quite believing what he was seeing, his breath coming in small clouds that hung in the cold air before dissolving. And he felt something break open in his chest, some tight fist of control he'd been holding for so long he'd forgotten it was there, and tears came without warning, running hot down his cold cheeks. And he didn't wipe them away, just stood there holding the candle and looking at those jars as though they were something holy, something beyond price or measure. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, lined up with a care that spoke of someone's labor, someone's hope that these things would be needed, would be found, would serve their purpose of keeping life going forward through the hard seasons. Some of the jars had labels, handwritten in pencil that had faded but was still legible. Green beans, blackberry jam, pickled beets, apple butter, and others had no labels, but their contents were visible through the glass, recognizable, real in a way that made Samuel's hunger roar back to life with an intensity that made him dizzy. He moved closer, setting the candle on one of the shelves, his hands reaching out to touch the jars, to lift them and feel their weight, to see that the seals were intact, that the contents looked preserved, looked safe, looked like they had been waiting all this time for exactly this moment, for exactly him. And beside the jars, on a lower shelf, were other things. A burlap sack that, when he opened it, released the faint smell of beans dried and hard as pebbles, and another sack that held something that felt like grain, and a tin container that rattled when he picked it up, and when he pried open the lid, he found matches, hundreds of them, still dry, still usable, still capable of making fire and light and warmth. In a corner, almost hidden behind the lowest shelf, was a wooden crate, and Samuel pulled it out carefully, his movements slow because his hand was shaking again, not from cold now, but from something else, from the overwhelming presence of mercy, of grace, of whatever you call it when the world shows you kindness you didn't earn and don't deserve but desperately, desperately need. The crate was heavy, and when he lifted the lid, he found canned goods inside. Soup, vegetables, corned beef hash, things with labels that were decades old, but cans that looked intact, that looked like they might still be good, might still be safe, might still offer what they promised. And beneath the cans, wrapped in cloth that had yellowed with age, was an envelope, and Samuel lifted it with both hands, feeling the weight of paper and ink, feeling the presence of words someone had written and left here. And he knew without opening it that this was important, that this was perhaps the most important thing in the cellar, more important even than the food, though his body disagreed violently with that assessment. Though his stomach was cramping now with the knowledge of how close relief was, how close he was to eating, to being full, to pushing back the hunger that had become his constant companion. He carried the envelope back to where the candle stood and opened it carefully, his cold fingers clumsy with the flap that had been sealed and sealed again over time, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and covered in handwriting that was careful and feminine, and spoke of someone who had been taught to write well, to make letters that were clear and beautiful, who had taken time and care with this message, who had wanted to be understood. The paper was brittle at the creases, threatening to tear, and Samuel unfolded it with the gentleness he might have used with a butterfly's wing, and held it close to the candle, and began to read, the words swimming slightly before his eyes until he blinked and they steadied, and then the voice of someone long gone spoke to him across whatever distance separates the living from their echoes. To whoever finds this, it began, and Samuel felt his throat tighten, felt the loneliness of that phrase, the hope contained in it, the faith that someone would come, would need what had been left, would understand. My name is Margaret Hensley, and if you are reading this, then you have found the provisions I left in the cellar of what was once my home. I want you to know they are meant for you. I left them intentionally, not as forgotten stores, but as a gift for whoever might need them most. Please take what you need without guilt, without hesitation. That is why they are here. Samuel had to pause, had to set the letter down and press his palms against his eyes, had to breathe through the tightness in his chest that threatened to become a sob, because he understood now that this was not just luck, not just fortune, but intention, someone's deliberate act of kindness extended forward in time to reach him, specifically him, though she had never known his name or face or need. He picked up the letter again and continued. I had a son, Thomas, who went to war in 1943 and did not return. He was 20 years old, and he loved these mountains, loved this cabin we built together, his father and I and him, back when he was still a boy, and believed he would live here forever. After we received word of his death, I could not stay. The cabin held too many memories, too much of his laughter and his plans, and his future that would never arrive. But I cannot abandon it completely, could not let it simply rot and fall to pieces, because that seemed like erasing him entirely, like admitting he had never been. The handwriting grew slightly shakier here, as though the writer had paused, had perhaps cried, had perhaps set down the pen and picked it up again later. So I decided to leave the cabin as a kind of offering, a shelter for anyone who might need it, and I stocked the cellar with everything I could preserve, everything that might help someone survive a hard winter, a hard season, a hard time. I think Thomas would have liked that, would have wanted his home to serve that purpose, to be a place of refuge rather than a monument to absence. Samuel read on, his breath shallow, his heart beating hard against his ribs. I do not know when you will find this, or in what condition you will be when you do, but I hope these provisions help you. I hope they give you strength to continue, to keep going, to find whatever it is you are looking for, even if you do not yet know what that is. I have been where you might be now, lost, hungry, desperate, unsure if I could take another step. My hunger was different than yours might be, perhaps, but hunger is hunger, whether it is for food or meaning or simply the will to see another morning. The letter continued on the back of the page. Please know that you are not forgotten, not abandoned, not without worth. The fact that you found this place, that you opened this door, that you descended these steps, that takes courage, takes the kind of stubborn will to survive that I admire more than I can say. You're the kind of person my son would have helped if he had lived, would have brought into our home and fed and clothed and sent back out into the world with supplies and hope and the knowledge that someone cared. Samuel's vision blurred again, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks of dirt across his face, and kept reading. When you leave, and I hope you do leave, I hope you survive and continue and find something better than this cold mountain and this empty cabin. Please consider adding your own note to this one, telling whoever comes after you that they too are welcome, that they too matter, that they too deserve to eat and rest and be warm. Perhaps together, we strangers across time, we can create a kind of chain of kindness, a thread of mercy that runs through these mountains and offers shelter to those who need it most. The letter was signed simply Margaret and dated August 1951, and beneath the signature she had added one final line: "May you find what you need, and may it be enough." Samuel folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it aside, and then he sat down on the cold stone floor of the cellar and wept, his shoulders shaking, his breath coming in gasps, because he had been alone for so long, had been forgotten for so long, had believed himself to be beyond the reach of kindness or care or basic human decency. And here in this dark hole in the ground, he had found proof that none of that was true, that someone had thought of him, had cared for him, had left him a gift across decades, across death itself, across the vast distance that separates all of us from each other, until something like this, some act of grace, some gesture of hope, closes that distance and reminds us we are not, after all, alone. If you've ever felt seen by a stranger's kindness, if you've ever received a gift you didn't expect and couldn't repay, maybe you understand what Samuel felt. Maybe you'd like to share where you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment, tell us your city, help us count the hearts gathered here by this fire. Samuel climbed back up the stone steps slowly, carrying what he could: a jar of green beans that felt solid and real in his hands, a tin of soup that bore a label so faded he could barely read the words, and the burlap sack of dried beans that would need soaking but promised sustenance of a kind he had almost forgotten existed. And when he emerged into the cabin, the light had changed, had grown dimmer and more blue, the way afternoon light does when snow begins to fall in earnest and the world narrows to just what you can see through the veil of white that descends like a curtain between you and everything beyond. The stove, he thought. The stove first, because without fire, nothing else mattered. Without warmth, he would simply be trading one form of cold death for another. And he set down his provisions carefully on the tilted table and turned his attention to that rust-orange iron box in the corner that had once been someone's source of heat and cooking and the kind of comfort that comes from watching flames dance behind grated doors. He opened the stove fully now and reached inside, pulling out the ash and debris with his bare hands, feeling the powder coat his fingers, feeling splinters and mouse nests, and the crumbled remains of what might have been paper or bark or something else entirely that had found its way inside over the years. Outside, through the window, he could see pine boughs heavy with snow, and he went to the door and opened it against the wind that had begun to gust, and gathered what he could find: dead branches that had fallen and were dry beneath their coating of snow, bits of bark that peeled away from a dead tree near the cabin, handfuls of pine needles that would catch quickly, and brought them inside, his arms full, his body already feeling stronger just from the knowledge that food waited, that he would eat soon, that the hunger that had been his companion for so long would finally be answered. Building the fire took time, took the careful arrangement of tinder and kindling, took 3 more of his precious matches before the pine needles caught and held, before the small flame grew brave enough to reach for the larger pieces, before the wood began to crackle and pop and release that smell that is like no other smell in the world, that particular perfume of burning pine and oak and whatever else goes into a fire, that scent that seems to carry in it all the comfort humanity has ever known. All the nights around flames, all the meals cooked and stories told and hands held out to warmth that pushes back the dark. Samuel stood before the stove and watched the fire establish itself, watched it grow from tentative flicker to confident blaze, and he felt the heat begin to radiate outward, felt it touch his face and hands and chest, felt the cabin itself seem to exhale, seem to wake from whatever frozen sleep it had fallen into, and he added more wood, larger pieces now, and closed the stove door most of the way, leaving it open just enough to allow air, but not so much that the heat escaped wastefully into the room. Water, he needed water, and he took the tin cup despite its hole and went back outside, scooping fresh snow into it, packing it down, filling it again and again until he had enough. And he set the cup on top of the stove where the hole wouldn't matter, where the snow would melt and heat and become something he could use to cook the beans, to prepare the soup, to make tea if he found any, to wash his face and hands and feel for a moment like something more than a ghost moving through a frozen world. The jar of green beans opened with effort. The lid sealed so tight he had to use his knife to pry it loose. And when it finally gave way with a pop that seemed too loud in the small space, he smelled vinegar and dill and something earthy and preserved, and he poured the contents into a small pot he'd found hanging on a nail, a pot that was dented but intact, and he set it on the stove beside the melting snow and watched the beans begin to heat. Watched steam rise from them, watched the liquid around them start to bubble, and his mouth watered so intensely he had to swallow, had to wipe his chin, had to grip the edge of the table to keep himself from simply grabbing the pot and drinking it scalding hot straight from a source. Patience, he told himself, patience, because he knew from experience that eating too fast after too long would make him sick, would waste this precious food, would turn gift into punishment. And so he waited, standing there in the warming cabin while the storm raged outside and the fire burned steady and sure inside its iron chamber. And he thought about Margaret Hensley, who had left this for him, who had trusted that someone would come, who had believed that kindness extended forward in time, could reach across decades and save a life, perhaps this life, perhaps his. When the beans were hot, not just warm but truly hot, steaming and fragrant, he poured them into a bowl he'd found, chipped along one edge but clean enough, and he sat at the table, and he picked up a spoon that had been lying on the shelf, and he said grace, the first time he'd done so in years, the words coming haltingly at first and then more smoothly. The old prayer his mother had taught him when he was a boy, and the world was simpler, and he believed that goodness was rewarded and badness punished, and everything made sense in the way things make sense when you are young and have not yet learned otherwise. The first bite tasted like salt and thyme and earth and care, tasted like someone's summer garden and someone's labor and someone's hope that this work would matter, would feed someone, would keep life going forward through the seasons that threatened to stop it. And Samuel chewed slowly, carefully, feeling the food in his mouth, feeling it slide down his throat, feeling his stomach receive it with something like gratitude, like recognition, like the memory of what it meant to be sustained, to be nourished, to be given what the body needs not just to survive, but to continue. He ate half the bowl and then stopped, forced himself to stop, because he knew he needed to let his body adjust, needed to wait before eating more. And he sat there with tears running down his face again, not sad tears, but something else, something he didn't have words for, something that felt like being seen, like being known, like being told that he mattered enough for someone to care, even someone who had never met him, who had been dead for decades, who had left this gift not knowing who would receive it, but trusting that whoever did would need it, would treasure it, would understand what it meant. The storm outside had grown fierce now, wind battering the cabin walls, snow piling against the door, but inside Samuel was warm, was fed, was safe, and he closed his eyes and listened to the fire, to the wind, to the sound of his own breathing. And he thought that perhaps this was enough, perhaps this moment was sufficient, perhaps he had been given what he needed not just to survive, but to remember why survival mattered, why it was worth the effort, why despite everything, despite the cold and the hunger and the loneliness and the long years of wandering, life was still precious, still worth protecting, still worth fighting for one more day. Maybe you know what it feels like to receive something you didn't earn but desperately needed, to be given grace when you expected nothing, to taste kindness in a meal prepared by hands you'll never hold. If you do, stay with us a while. Let this story warm you the way that fire warmed Samuel. Morning came slowly, the way it does after storms, the light filtering through snow-covered windows in shades of pearl and silver, and Samuel woke on the floor near the stove where he had laid out his coat as a bed and used his pack as a pillow. And for a moment he couldn't remember where he was, couldn't place the walls around him or the warmth that surrounded him or the absence of that grinding hunger that had been his morning companion for longer than he cared to count. Then memory returned. The cellar, the jars, Margaret's letter, the meal that had tasted like forgiveness. And he sat up slowly, his body stiff and sore but stronger than it had been, fed and rested and ready, perhaps, to consider what came next, what he would do with this gift of time, this extension of life that had been granted to him by a stranger's foresight and faith. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, and he added wood to it now, coaxing it back to flame. And he melted more snow and made himself another small meal, eating slowly, carefully, letting his body adjust to the presence of food after so long without. And as he ate, he looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not just an abandoned shelter, but a place that had been loved once, had been home to people who had laughed and argued and eaten together and watched the seasons change. Through these same windows, there were things that needed fixing: the broken table leg, a section of roof where he could see daylight through a crack, the door that no longer hung quite square in its frame. And Samuel found himself wanting to repair them, wanting to leave the cabin better than he'd found it, wanting to add his own small contribution to Margaret's legacy of care, wanting to be part of that chain of kindness she had written about, that thread of mercy running through time. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, using tools he found in a corner, a hammer with a loose head that he tightened, a saw with rust on its blade that he scraped clean, nails in a coffee can that rattle when he picked it up, and he repaired what he could with the materials at hand, cutting wood to length, hammering pieces into place, making the cabin sound again, making it ready for whoever might come next, whoever might need shelter the way he had needed it, whoever might be. Walking through snow with hunger as their companion and desperation as their guide. When the repairs were done, he cleaned the cabin as best he could, sweeping the floor with a broom made of bound twigs, washing the table and shelf with melted snow, arranging the remaining furniture so the space felt less abandoned and more intentional, more like a place someone might choose to stay rather than simply collapse into. And then he stood in the center of the room and looked at what he'd done and felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride, perhaps, or satisfaction, or simply the quiet pleasure of work completed, of making something better, of leaving a place improved by his presence rather than diminished. He returned to the cellar then, descending those stone steps one last time, and he took only what he needed: a few jars, some dried beans, one of the tins of soup, leaving the rest for whoever came after him, trusting Margaret's vision forward into time, trusting that there would be others who needed this, who deserved this, who would find their way here when the world above became too cold or too cruel or too empty to bear. And then he did what Margaret had asked, what she had trusted someone would do. He found paper and pencil among his own supplies, and he wrote his own letter, his handwriting rough and unpracticed, but sincere, and he told whoever would read it that they were welcome, that the food was meant for them, that they should take what they needed without guilt or shame, that someone cared about their survival, about their story, about whatever path had brought them to this cabin in the wilderness. He wrote about Margaret, about her son Thomas, who had loved these mountains, about the chain of kindness that she had started, and he was now continuing, about how none of us are alone even when we feel most isolated, even when the world seems to have forgotten us, even when we've forgotten ourselves, because somewhere, somehow, there are threads connecting us. There are hands reaching across time and distance. There are people we will never meet who care about us anyway, who hope for us anyway, who leave gifts for us in cellars beneath the snow. Before he sealed the letter in an envelope he'd fashioned from paper folded carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing of value he still carried, the only possession that marked him as someone who had once served, who had once been part of something larger than himself, who had once worn a uniform and believed in duty and sacrifice and brotherhood. His silver star, earned in a war whose details had faded, but whose cost he still felt in his bones, in his dreams, in the way he startled at sudden sounds and couldn't sleep without checking exits. He held the medal for a long moment, feeling its weight, remembering the day it had been pinned to his chest by a general whose name he could no longer recall, remembering the ceremony and the flag and the friends who hadn't survived to receive their own medals, who were buried in soil so far from home they might as well be on another planet. And he felt the grief of that, the survivor's burden that never quite lifts, the question that has no answer. Why them and not me? Why did I get to keep walking when they fell? But he also felt something else as he held that medal, felt a kind of release, a sense that perhaps this was what it had been for all along, not to mark his own valor or achievement, but to pass forward as a gift, as a token, as proof to whoever found it that they were not forgotten, that someone who had worn the uniform understood what it meant to be cold and hungry and alone. Someone who had carried his own burdens understood the weight of theirs. Someone who had survived when he shouldn't. Have wanted them to survive too. Wanted to give them a reason to keep going. Wanted to tell them that their life mattered, even if no one else knew their name. He placed the medal in the envelope with a letter, and he sealed it. And he carried it down to the cellar and left it on the shelf beside Margaret's original note. And he stood there for a moment in the candlelight. He had brought one candle down to see by. And he said a prayer, not for himself this time, but for whoever would come next, for whoever would need this refuge, for whoever would read these letters and understand that they were part of something larger than their own struggle, part of a story that began before them and would continue after them, part of the great chain of human kindness that holds us all together when everything else threatens to tear us apart. When he climbed back up those stone steps for the last time and closed the trapdoor and covered it again with dust so it would wait for the next person who needed to find it, Samuel felt lighter, felt unburdened in a way he hadn't felt in years, felt as though he had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying without knowing it, had finally found a way to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid, but could at least be acknowledged, honored. Fast forward. He gathered his things, his pack, his coat, the small bundle of food he'd taken from the cellar wrapped carefully in cloth, and he stood at the door of the cabin and looked back one last time at the space that had saved his life, that had reminded him he was human, that had given him not just food and warmth, but something more precious than either, the knowledge that he was seen, that he mattered, that someone cared. The storm had passed, and the world outside was white and silent and beautiful in the way winter is beautiful when you're not dying in it. When you have a full stomach and warm clothes and a reason to keep walking, and Samuel stepped out into that whiteness and closed the door behind him gently. Carefully, the way you close the door on something sacred, something you'll remember always, something that changed you in ways you're only beginning to understand. He walked north, toward the valley he'd been heading for before the storm, toward the town where he'd heard there might be work, might be shelter, might be a chance to rebuild something resembling a life. And as he walked, he thought about Margaret and Thomas and all the people who had passed through this world, leaving small gifts behind them, leaving traces of kindness that rippled forward through time, touching lives they would never know about, saving people they would never meet, creating that invisible web of care that holds us all together when we need it most. And he thought that perhaps this was enough, this small act of continuation, this simple gesture of taking what he'd been given and passing it forward, this quiet decision to be part of the chain rather than break it, to add his link to Margaret's, to trust that someone after him would add theirs, and on, forward through time, a thread of mercy running through these mountains and through the world beyond, connecting all of us who have been lost, who have been found, who have known hunger, who have been fed, who have received grace we didn't earn and are trying, in our own small ways, to extend that grace to others. The sun broke through the clouds as he walked, and the snow sparkled like diamonds scattered across the earth, and Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Hope, real and solid and sustainable, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances changing, but on understanding that even in the hardest seasons, even in the coldest winter, there are shelters waiting, there are cellars full of provision. There are letters written by strangers who believe you deserve to survive, who trust you to carry their kindness forward, who know that you are not, despite everything, forgotten. If this story found you when you needed it, if it reminded you that kindness echoes across time and distance, then maybe you'd help us reach 1,000 hearts by the fire. Subscribe, share where you're listening from tonight, and know that you're part of this chain too, part of this thread of mercy that connects all of us who believe that the smallest acts of grace are the ones that save the world, one cold wanderer at a time.